I know that everyone must be getting a bit restless, but let's try to stick together. I'm going to talk about this work that we've been doing for maybe a year and a half now on prioritizing vulnerability response. This is work with a bunch of other people, so let's just get to that. So there'll be a test on that later. I'm running out of good jokes for that lawyer slide, but I'm sure that we'll come up with some better ones. So I will do some verbal background. The slides sort of assume that everyone knows what CVSS is. CVSS is a scoring standard produced by FIRST, which is the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, and it is a way to talk about how bad a vulnerability is. They're pretty explicit that it is limited to the technical severity of the vulnerability in the system. I don't believe that's what everyone uses it for. I believe a bunch of people basically say, this is a 7.8 that is worse than a 7.6. I will fix the 7.8 first, and I will go home because I have ran out of time. We think that that's a bad idea for lots of reasons. I'm going to focus on more of the constructive parts of vulnerability management with this talk, because it's about the more constructive paper. If you would like to read more about why we think CVSS needs to change, you can read that Towards Improving CVSS paper. That's a link, so you can click on it when you get it in the Slack. We proposed a stakeholder-specific vulnerability categorization, SSVC. We focused on a couple of things with this. Right? We want to focus on decisions, and specifically decisions about vulnerability management, like decisions about which thing you should patch next. Not the technical severity, because I don't think that's super helpful in deciding which thing is most likely to cause your organization to have a bunch of pain. Right? There are some relatively simple exploits that, if they're in an important system, can be a lot worse than if some total ownership is in something else. And anyway, because vulnerabilities tend to get chained together and the adversary usually ends up with total control over the relevant system if they want it, I'm not sure that technical severity is the right thing to prioritize on, especially for someone who's deploying patches that are provided by the developer. We wanted it also to be transparent, right, which so that everyone can see how we made it and also understand what the decisions were. I don't think that is currently the case with existing vulnerability management guidance. We wanted role-specific recommendations. So basically, the people who build patches probably care about different things than the people who deploy them. I think that most of the people in this room could be in either. Any vendor is going to want to have to deploy patches in its own systems because you have to build them and then roll them out to its customers. But also, you probably aren't running only software that you've written yourself. So separating those roles, the different teams, I think is important. We also designed what we can call an experiment to test the marking consistency, basically, which I think is totally reusable. And thanks to all my co-authors, Eric, Alan, Art, and Dina. I think that you know some of them. So more specifically, what did we do here? Right. The paper has a decision process and descriptions for all of the words to make decisions about vulnerability management. I think that this syncs with a bunch of the talks earlier today, right? Vulnerability management is related to what Gadi was talking about as far as which bugs you let go on, right? It's related to how you protect private information, right? All of these things. But perhaps more importantly, the paper sort of documents our decision-making process for how we built the decision-making process. So you can adapt it if you want it to be slightly different, which it probably should be, because your situation is probably slightly different from ours or anyone else's. So we wanted to be clear about those things. The roles here are not super complicated. Like I said, they're the developer and the applier. These track to the roles that we manage for coordinated vulnerability disclosure. CERT and CERT-CC is sort of the coordinator of last resort in a lot of ways. We coordinate a bunch of vulnerabilities where the vendor is either unwilling or unable to handle the report, either because they're new or because it is a complicated multi-party thing. We have been doing vulnerability coordination since 1988, so we think that we know what we're talking about there. What a decision is actually a priority of the action on the work item. Work item is basically a patch, either making it or deploying it. So we propose that everything that you do on your system, on your network, your whole enterprise, only really has 4 priorities. Right? Either you're going to defer on it, and you're not going to do it right now, and you're probably never going to get to it. You might reevaluate it later. You'll do it when you do the rest of the scheduled maintenance on the system, which hopefully you do. Or scheduled in, like, some cases might mean the system dies every month and is totally rebuilt, and so once it's rebuilt, it'll be handled. Right? Out of band is pretty much, you're going to spend some overtime on it, and immediate is like the whole company network is maybe threatened, and we might go out of business, so we're going to stop what we're doing and make sure this is fixed. Hopefully, very few of those would actually happen. But if they do, they should be given the appropriate priority. So we're talking about the risk that the vulnerability poses to either the internet or the infrastructure or whatever. This is uncomfortable, I think, for people. Currently, CVSS gives you the appearance of 100 options from 0 to 10 by 0.1s. And it makes it seem like 9.9 is not so bad or less bad than 10.0. So if you have a 10.0, you do that first. Then you do the 9.9s, right? And it gives you this feeling of control over the priorities, and it doesn't say make your own decisions about everything that's in the highest category. But that's an illusion, basically. The way that the standard is designed, those numbers are only accurate to within 0.5 point. Because it's a regression model. It's not even a linear regression model, so there's not great requirements on that. When we do well, I didn't do these studies. When Luke and them did this study, they found that expert security practitioners who were asked to rate vulnerabilities for their CVSS score had a lot of variability, like plus or minus 1.5, give or take, depending on exactly what was going on. But that's close enough for the current purposes. Which means that actually medium is all one qualitatively the same category anyway. 5.5 plus or minus 1.5 is 4 to 7. So CVSS medium is all one qualitative category anyway, except for that you're not sure that it's a medium. It might be a high or a low. Because the error bounds cross the decision boundaries of the categories, right? If it's a 9, it's just as likely to be an 8.5 as a 9.5, even if everything goes perfectly, which means you can't really tell the difference between high and critical most of the time. We wanted to not have that happen, because that seems bad. So we kept the decision categories qualitative, just defer, scheduled, out of band, immediate, because to go to numbers and then convert them back to categories when there's not really, like fastest plus fastest doesn't equal 2. So we didn't want to make that sort of conceptual mistake. So we use decision trees. We only really have 4 decision points. This is another difference from CVSS. CVSS vectors have, depending on if you count the base vector or if you want to include environmental and other things, you might have 12 or 14 decision points that you need to have an answer on before you can decide the priority, because it wants all this stuff. I think that that's a bit of overkill. The decision tree basically just abbreviates what you should do to combine the different outputs for the 4 different decision points, which is not super complicated, but there's a lot of detail in how you assign those, and so that's a lot of what's up for discussion, because I don't think that that's done. The different roles have slightly different decision points that we recommend using. I'm going to make sure I emphasize that this is a recommendation. You could decide that there's other decision points you want to use, but for the patch applier, right, we think that the state of the exploitation of the vulnerability, the exposure of the vulnerable system, the mission impact if the vulnerability is executed against that system, and the safety impact of if the system is compromised are the only things that really matter, right? The patch deployer, the person who's going to build the patch, doesn't know the deployment environment so well, so they're going to look at things like the utility and the technical impact instead of the other things. But that is it. I mean, there's 10 pages of describing what all of those mean, but not so complicated. I'll give an example of exploitation so you can see sort of the level of detail. For those of you who have been following the sort of CVSS's evolving space, you probably saw, I guess, the Black Hat talk, but also a Weiss paper about EPSS. That is not the same thing as what we're talking about here, because EPSS is about predicting things in the future. We're talking about just documenting what is currently the case at whatever the time is, right? So roughly, if there's good, shareable, reliable evidence that adversaries are actually using this vulnerability in an exploit in the wild, then it's worse than if they're not. We have a middle case where the proof of concept, where if there's a proof of concept, I think that we observe that most of the time it will be able to move into active exploitation within a month or so you probably want to care about it sooner. The POC description is a bit more nuanced because there's a bunch of different things that might make it POC. We decided to lump those all together because for the purposes of caring about which things you should patch first, it's all pretty much the same. And so you want to parse these things. It's a little bit complicated, but hopefully straightforward. So what this essentially does is give us, say, a set of 4 things. You know, exploitation is active, mission impact is minimal, safety impact is minimal, and exposure is unavoidable. And then you track that down through the decision tree, and you get to a node that tells you that that means you should do it, I don't know, scheduled. I don't have that memorized. That's probably wrong, but you know what I mean. This is both more work, because the individual appliers will have to do a little bit, but also most of this is actually asset management. Right, knowing your network architecture lets you answer a lot of these questions once per the device, and that doesn't change super often. I also think that things like exploitation, especially where exploitation is proof of concept, is basically automatable as a clever internet search over Metasploit, ExploitDB, the right GitHub search terms, some weird paste bin things, whatever, right? So some of these might be just facts about the internet. Some of them might be doable only once, which means that given those data inputs, which you don't have to do super often, you should be able to automate doing the decision tree over your entire asset inventory, and then say, patch this thing most importantly with this vol or whatever. You know, obviously this is still all early work, and so we don't have all of the tools like published to do this. But I know that there are asset management tools that encapsulate this sort of stuff in JSON or whatever, and I don't think it would be terribly difficult. Okay, so that was the actual stuff we produced as a hypothesis. Let me tell you about how we evaluated it and came to think it's a good idea. So we did a bunch of testing. Most of it was informal evaluations by just basically having an hour meeting of 5 people evaluate a vulnerability based on what we know about it. We'd get 2 steps through the tree and be like, oh, I don't understand what the scope is actually for if this is in the web server, or if it's in the operating system, or if it's in the application, the web application. It's like, okay, well, how do we define that? Fine. Right? So we had to go back and do it again. So we did that a bunch. And that's not super surprising. But we actually also did a formal pilot study where I did a little bit of experiment design and used my little bit of interaction with the usable security folks to measure Interrater Agreement, which is basically a psychology term. But what it means is just measuring how much the 6 of us agreed with each other when we rated a vulnerability. So one of the things that CVSS, I think, has some trouble with is that if I rate whatever, Heartbleed, and Sunil rates it, you rate it, and you rate it, we will probably come up with numbers that are super different. That's what that study showed that I pointed out earlier, that it varies by like 1.5 points up or down if you have security experts rate it. That is a big problem. We want different experts to rate the same vulnerability using the system, the same score, so that it's consistent. So the Interrater Agreement is just a statistical measure of how much that happens. So basically, we have everything documented in the paper with the trees and what they mean and how to do it. And I gave examples of what the pilot vols were. I listed all of them, some of the context, whatever. If anyone really wants all of the contexts that I made up, you can have them. Let me know. So I think this is fairly straightforward. We get 6 people. We each do it. We see how much we match. So there's a nice little formula for Fleiss's kappa, which you can find. And if you're crazy, you can implement it in Excel, which is not the easiest way to do these sorts of things. But there were some mixed results. So kappa less than 0 is bad. We didn't have any of those. Closer to 1 is better. Really, only state of exploitation was very close. But how close to 1 is good enough changes based on how many options there are. So these aren't all directly comparable. Right, so safety impact and mission impact have 5 options. So the fact that they're low isn't as bad as like portfolio value, which only had 2 options and was technically higher, but is worse and wasn't savable. So we scrapped that and replaced it with utility. We used all of this and the evidence that everyone documented as why they made the decision to improve all of this. So I think that if we reran it, we would have exploitation closer to 1 and so on. So this, I think, is a key point in the way I feel like we could be doing this. Right? If we want to make sure that we're all speaking the same language, sort of what we've been talking about, right? There are ways to test that. You get 5 different people from different backgrounds to do the thing. You can measure how much we agree based on what we're saying we're actually thinking. And I think that it would be a better way to do development of, I'm going to stick on vulnerability management because this is what I've been doing, right? To what those terms should be if we measured actual agreement of what the text is, so we get the thing we're measuring for, which is agreement, rather than other things. Like we just sort of do whoever is most important gets their way or something. I don't think that we should do that. This is just really a process and a hypothesis. The paper we published last month, but we need community input on it. It is not done, right? The study should be repeated with a more diverse group of participants than just 6 CERT employees. But we wanted to make sure it was passable before we published it. I think it's a valid hypothesis that you could probably use, but it's going to need to be refined. Other rating systems like CVSS could just use that sort of standards development process to like ensure better inter-rater agreement, and they could totally ignore everything else we say. That would also be fine. So I think that I've hooked onto this evidence-based decision-making, evidence-based policy-making thing before. I think it's quite important because I would rather make decisions based on evidence than on how we feel about what's going on, right? So you can look at the decision trees. They're also sort of ugly because I hacked that together in LaTeX, but it's fine now. But they document how you combine these decisions. You might want to change that. But you also might want to take it and test it out. This not pretending that things can be quantitative when you don't need them to be, when they can just stay qualitative, I think is important to sit with, even though it might initially be uncomfortable. And also just the different stakeholder groups, I think is important to recognize that we don't really have one-size-fits-all solutions for risk management here. Everyone's going to need to adapt a little bit. OK. Thank you very much. I'll take any questions. I think Bob has one in the back.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. This is much louder, I think. Anyway, okay. So, any questions so far?
Bob's got his hand up.
Oh, Bob.
So I'll start out with a statement. I think your diagnosis of the problems with CVSS is right on track, and I really like the proposal. But in the interest of resolving a little cognitive dissonance, you went into this by saying that you didn't want to just rate things based on technical severity. But your pilot study showed that the two things with overwhelmingly highest correlation among raters were exploitation and technical impact, and the two of those combined seem like a pretty good proxy for technical severity. So I'm wondering whether whether what we've got is a minor or a major adjustment, or whether you think maybe that there is additional work to be done to move this a little further away from technical severity.
Sure. So this just means that technical impact was a thing that we agreed on, not how useful it is. And because CVSS has honed all of our abilities to understand technical severity so much, I think that is partly why we agreed on it. But also, our proposal only has two values for technical impact, partial and total. And so it's relatively easy to agree on that. And we actually don't use that value in the applier tree at all, just the developer tree. And so for the applier, it is totally irrelevant how much we agree on it. Basically just exploitation and exposure are the two important things for our applier scenario. That's our hypothesis. But that's a good point that we are good at measuring and agreeing on technical impact, and so it might be some work for the community to stretch itself to get better at agreeing on these other values. So thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a really helpful answer.
Thanks. Okay, we also had a couple other additional questions in the Slack. So we had John DeVasia. Okay, actually, you can ask the question.
The question really was around this idea of trying to get to one, right? Everybody has the same opinion. Isn't that itself dangerous? Wouldn't an attacker or an adversary try to exploit the fact that, hey, they know that the defenders are following this framework to actually, stage an attack?
Thanks. So I think that that's a good point. I think this is why I would like to emphasize the stakeholder-specific nature of our proposal. So it's given a description. Everyone who reads the description will agree that a given vulnerability has the same priority, but it doesn't say that everyone has to use the same descriptions. So if for one community or vertical or whatever, protecting certain things is more important, then they will have different answers than people who believe that protecting other things or prioritizing other things is differently important. And this sort of groupthink, I think, only happens if it's internet-wide, which is impossible anyway. But I think that also the flip side of your question is if you have two analysts who sit at the same organization at a bank, and they're going to be in charge of prioritizing what gets fixed before everyone goes home, you don't want the answer to be dependent on which analyst it goes to. Because then essentially the security of your bank is a random number generator as to who pulls the ticket out of the JIRA queue, and that seems worse. If you think it's not worse, I would like to talk about that.
So in specifically speaking about the criteria that you selected, I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, because it hit very close to home. Like during the middle of a crisis, like you're in the middle of an incident response and you've got things that are actively being exploited, or you need to patch, or you see that these vulnerabilities are critical. Whenever that crisis comes up, the policy of saying we patch at this rate with this CVSS score or whatnot, I see that all of that policy gets thrown out the window during a crisis or an emergency, and it comes down to your executives or leaders making up the exact same rubric on the fly in the middle of the meeting and determining, how quickly and how many lunches do we need to skip, who has to work overtime, these types of things. So some of the same direction you're talking about. So can you talk a little bit more about specifically why those were the ones that were chosen and how you really defined those and fleshed them out?
Sure. Thanks, Joel. So exploitation is in CVSS environmental stuff sort of right now, but it's not core, and so we wanted to make it core. Mission impact is taken from FEMA continuity of operations, and is in general part of broader risk management, and so we brought that down. We adapted safety impact from the FAA and how you determine what you need to do about the airplane, if the airplane's going to be grounded or not. And we broadened that a bit with some guidance from actually the CDC about well-being and how they determine epidemiology stuff. And we brought that in just because safety was too narrow for the whole set of things. Why we thought that these are the most important came down to some amount of just experience of coordinating so many vols and talking to people who had a similar experience to what you said, where it's the executives are going to use these things anyway because that's their risk management training. So let's bring that down and make it clear. And if it comes down to someone higher in the chain says that you patch this thing before you go home, and that's part of the accepted decision-making process, I just think that should be in the decision-making process and clear so that everyone agrees on it. And I think that part of what you're pointing at is it seems like it would be easier to refine and improve the decision-making during a crisis if you can think about it calmly ahead of time. And that's what we're trying to elicit and let people do. I think that everyone will have slightly different ones, and that's great. But this should let them try to talk that out a little bit ahead of time. Is that sort of where you're?
So I like where you were coming from with drawing from mission effect and those types of things. Do you feel that, because I think it's definitely the right direction, and I totally get it, do you feel that educating those that are patching or helping to make the decisions on that type of theory and background and way to grade that is going to be a challenge with adoption with something like this?
So if there is no one in an organization doing continuity of operations, I think that they'll have a problem. So yes, someone will have to get educated. Yes, that will be a challenge. It may be connecting the vulnerability management team to other risk management teams in the organization and just increasing inter-organization communication rather than educating the security team. And I would hope that that would be a lighter lift. And that's why this is an asset management thing, right? So if you don't know what assets you're protecting, you're going to have a hard time protecting them.
Okay. Other questions? All right. Well, thank you, Jonathan. This is actually a really cool new methodology. We're going to, so